December 15th,
The situation is
1943.
critical. We
Camp
must move
Hearn,
at dawn.
Texas.
Understood, sir.
Rosalind Ashford stood alone in the center of what would become the most dangerous classroom in America. 5,000 books surrounded her shelves, stretching floor to ceiling, packed with volumes her students' government had spent a decade burning. The morning light came through stained windows, sharp and unforgiving the way Texas light always came in December, illuminating particles of dust suspended in the air like accusations waiting to settle. The room smelled of oak wood and old paper and lemon oil. Beneath it all, something else. Fear, perhaps, or possibility. The particular stillness before something irreversible begins. Her hands trembled as she held the typewritten list. 180 names in alphabetical order, surnames, first military ranks abbreviated with Germanic efficiency. 180 German prisoners of war who had volunteered, actually raised their hands and volunteered for an education program they didn't fully understand. 180 men who just 3 months ago had been fighting to kill Americans like her husband. Like Owen, whose plane had disappeared over the Philippine Sea in August. She wore her wedding ring on her left hand, a simple gold band that caught the morning light as her fingers moved down the unfamiliar names. Adler Heinrich, Becker Joseph, Fischer Klaus, Lehmann Franz, Steiner Victor. German names that still sounded like the enemy despite her grandmother's Bavarian lullabies, despite the fact that she'd been speaking German since childhood, despite knowing that nationality and ideology weren't the same thing even if they often traveled together. The ring felt heavier than gold should feel, as if Owen's absence had somehow transferred its weight to the metal circling her finger. 4 months. 4 months since his reconnaissance plane had vanished during what was supposed to be a routine patrol over empty ocean. 4 months of waiting for a telegram that might say anything: missing in action, presumed dead, confirmed killed in action, or the one she couldn't let herself hope for because hope felt like tempting fate found alive. Outside the windows, she could hear the rhythmic sound of boots on gravel, the precise cadence of men marching in formation. German voices calling out numbers in a language that still made her heart clench despite her fluency. The camp sprawled across 720 acres of Robertson County farmland. 4,800 prisoners housed in neat rows of wooden barracks that stretched toward the horizon like a temporary city of captivity. 4,800 men who had fought for Adolf Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. 4,800 men who now ate better than they'd eaten in their entire lives while their families starved in German cities, being systematically reduced to rubble. On her desk, tucked beneath a stack of course catalogs from Sam Houston State Teachers College, lay an envelope. Red Cross insignia stamped in the upper left corner, that distinctive symbol that meant official military communication about prisoners or casualties or men whose fates hung suspended between life and death. Her name written across the front in Owen's handwriting, that familiar script she'd memorized from love letters during their brief courtship. The last letter he'd sent before his plane went down. She'd received it 6 weeks ago, forwarded through military postal channels, arriving with mundane mail as if it were just another piece of correspondence instead of possibly the last words her husband would ever write to her. It had sat unopened in her desk for 42 days, she'd counted. Every morning when she came to work, she counted another day of not opening it. Some truths once known couldn't be unknown. And as long as the envelope remained sealed, she existed in a quantum state where Owen was both alive and dead, where hope and despair occupied the same impossible space, where she didn't have to face whatever finality those pages contained. The clock on the wall, standard military issue with white face and black numbers, read 8:45. 15 minutes until her first students arrived. She'd spent 3 full days preparing this room with the precision of someone setting an elaborate trap. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, positioned on the shelf at exact eye level for a man of average height. Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Beside it, that devastating novel about World War I that the Nazis had burned in 1933, one of the first books thrown onto the pyres when they decided which ideas deserved to exist, both banned in Nazi Germany for over a decade, both waiting for hands that had been trained to reach for weapons but might be willing to reach for something else. Rosalind was 28 years old, though grief had aged her in ways that didn't show in mirrors. She'd graduated from Smith College 6 years ago with highest honors in literature, married a Navy pilot she'd known for 6 months, and watched him deploy to the Pacific before their honeymoon photographs had even been developed. That was March of 1943. By August, he was missing. By September, she was applying for this position with the War Department's Special Projects Division because the alternative was returning to Philadelphia to live with her parents and slowly dissolve into decorative widowhood. Education officer, the job description had said in the careful bureaucratic language designed to reveal nothing. Camp Hearn, Texas. Experience with literature and teaching required. Knowledge of German language preferred but not mandatory. Ability to work professionally with enemy prisoners essential. Highest security clearance necessary, discretion absolute. She'd learned German from her grandmother Wilhelmina, who'd immigrated from Bavaria in 1897, with 2 steamer trunks full of books and an iron determination that German language and culture shouldn't be abandoned just because geography had changed. Oma had taught her the language of fairy tales and Christmas carols and soft words whispered at bedtime when she thought young Rosalind was already sleeping. Now that same language belonged to the enemy. The language of men who'd bombed London and invaded Poland and sent Owen's plane spiraling into dark Pacific waters, where the ocean floor was measured in thousands of feet, and bodies were never recovered. Her parents had opposed this position with a vehemence that still stung. Her father, a banker in Philadelphia who'd lived through the Great War and remembered what it meant to lose an entire generation, had been brutally direct during her last visit home. Working with Germans while your husband is missing, fighting them, he'd said, voice tight with judgment she knew came from fear. What kind of woman does that? What will people say at church? What will they say at the club? Have you thought about how this reflects on the family? She hadn't told him that she didn't care what people said, that grief had burned away her capacity to worry about reputation, that she needed purpose more than she needed approval, that teaching enemies to think might prevent the next war even if it couldn't stop this one. The door opened without a knock, military efficiency that didn't waste time on civilian courtesies. Lieutenant Colonel Thaddeus Brennan entered, his uniform pressed so sharply the creases looked capable of drawing blood. He was 45 years old, silver-haired despite his relative youth, with eyes that revealed nothing unless he chose to reveal something, and a face that had been trained into military neutrality. He'd been commanding Camp Hearn since its opening in December of 1942, exactly 1 year ago this week, and had developed a reputation throughout the POW camp system as a man who followed the Geneva Convention to the absolute letter. Not from sentimentality, but from cold calculation that treating prisoners well was both morally correct and strategically valuable. He also believed in something most officers considered dangerously naive, that enemy soldiers could be rehabilitated. That ideology could be dismantled, that education was a weapon more powerful than bombs in building lasting peace. Miss Ashford, his voice carried the flat vowels of Michigan, clipped and precise. Ready for your first students? She straightened her shoulders, forced steadiness into her voice despite the trembling in her hands. As ready as I'll ever be, Colonel. He walked to the window with measured steps, 30 years of military bearing evident in every movement, and looked out at the compound where prisoners were moving between barracks and work details in the pale morning light. From this particular window you could see nearly the entire camp. Neat rows of barracks, mess halls, recreation areas, the wire fences that were more symbolic than functional since there was nowhere to escape to anyway in the middle of Texas farmland, 300 miles from any border. "You've read the files I sent?" he asked without turning around. "3 times, sir. Memorized most of the names and relevant details. Then you understand what we're attempting here." He still didn't turn his reflection ghostly and insubstantial in the window glass. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office believes that enemy ideology can be systematically dismantled through carefully managed exposure to democratic principles and banned literature. They believe, or at least they hope, that we can transform these men from committed fascists to potential allies for a democratic Germany. From true believers in Nazi ideology to advocates for something different. And you, Colonel? She kept her voice carefully neutral, professional. What do you believe? Long silence. His reflection remained motionless. Then, I believe my son died at Kasserine Pass last February. I believe he was 22 years old and had never been outside Indiana before the army sent him to Africa. Never seen mountains or ocean or desert. Never traveled farther from home than Chicago. His voice was carefully controlled, showing no emotion despite the devastating content. I believe that if we don't find a way to make peace stick this time, really stick, not the botched, vindictive mess we made after the Great War, then my grandson, if I ever have one, will die in another war with Germany 20 years from now. Because that's what happened last time. We won the war and lost the peace, and 20 years later we were doing it all over again. He finally turned from the window and she saw something raw flash across his face before military discipline shuttered it away. I believe we have to try something different this time, Miss Ashford, because what we did after Versailles clearly didn't work. We humiliated Germany, crushed them economically, took everything we could take and gave them every reason to want revenge. Then we acted surprised when they elected a madman who promised to make them great again. He paused. So yes, I believe in this program. I believe that if we can change even a fraction of these men's minds, if we can send them home. Believing in democracy instead of fascism, it might accomplish more than all the bombing raids and tank battles and beach landings combined. Rosalind felt something shift in her chest, recognition of shared grief transformed into purpose. I didn't know about your son, Colonel. I'm profoundly sorry. Don't be sorry. Be effective. The mask of command slid back into place, expression hardening into military efficiency. These men volunteered for this program. In a camp of 4,800 prisoners, only 180 raised their hands. That's less than 4%. That means something. It suggests curiosity at minimum, perhaps doubt beginning to creep in. Your job is to turn that curiosity into questions they can't stop asking, that doubt into transformation they can't resist. By teaching them literature, by showing them what ideas look like when they're free. He chose his words with visible care. When they're not filtered through propaganda and censorship and state-approved narratives. When they're allowed to be complex and contradictory and true to human experience rather than political ideology. But you need to understand something. His expression grew grave. Not all of them are here out of genuine curiosity or budding doubt. Some are here because this is the warmest building in camp and we serve coffee before class. Some are here because their friends volunteered and they didn't want to seem afraid, and some... His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Some are here specifically to resist, to disrupt, to prove that Nazi ideology can withstand American propaganda, to intimidate the others who might actually be questioning. How will I distinguish between them? You won't, not at first, maybe not for weeks. You'll have to earn their trust one by one, prove that you're worth listening to, demonstrate that these books contain something valuable enough to risk whatever consequences they might face from the hardliners in camp. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. One more thing. There's a prisoner named Victor Steiner, 32 years old, Unteroffizier in the Afrika Corps, wounded at El Alamein, captured during the retreat. He's the elected spokesman for the Nazi hardliners in this camp, and yes, they hold elections. They've recreated the entire party hierarchy in miniature. He volunteered for your program specifically, and I can guarantee you it's not because he wants to learn. Why then? To disrupt it, to intimidate the others, to prove that German soldiers can't be corrupted by American books and ideas, to be a constant visible reminder that there are consequences for those who waver in their ideological commitment. Brennan's expression was grim. He's intelligent, committed, and potentially dangerous despite being a prisoner. If he becomes a problem, if any of them become a problem, you tell me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. These men are prisoners, yes, but they're also combat veterans who've been trained to kill efficiently. Understand? She nodded, though her throat had gone dry and her hands had started trembling again. After he left, she stood alone among her 5,000 weapons, though they looked nothing like weapons. Just books on shelves, accumulated human wisdom and folly bound in leather and cloth and paper. The clock read 8:58. 2 minutes. She thought about all the questions she couldn't answer. About Owen somewhere in the Pacific, alive or dead in ways she might never know. About whether showing kindness to Germans was betrayal of the men they'd killed or necessary work toward preventing the next generation of killing. About whether education could genuinely transform men who'd believed so deeply in racial superiority and genocide and the divine right of the strong to dominate the weak. About whether she possessed the strength for any of this, or whether her grief and anger and desperate need for purpose had driven her to accept an impossible task. She pulled Owen's envelope from the drawer one more time, held it up to the window light, trying to see through the paper to the words written inside, as if some form of X-ray vision might let her know without actually opening it. The paper was soft from being handled so many times, taken out and put back 100 times or more. The corners were bent from being carried in her purse, hidden in her desk, touched with trembling fingers during moments of weakness. Inside was either goodbye or hope or something in between. Inside were Owen's last words to her, and she wasn't ready. Might never be ready. She put it back in the drawer beneath the course catalogs. Tomorrow would be soon enough to be brave. Or the day after. Or the day after that. Some truths could wait a little longer. The door opened again at precisely 9 o'clock, military punctuality even among prisoners. 20 men entered in small groups of 3 and 4, their boots making varied sounds on the wooden floor. Some heavy and deliberate, announcing presence, some light and hesitant as if trying not to be noticed. Young men mostly, though a few showed premature gray in their hair or deep lines around their eyes that spoke of things witnessed that couldn't be unseen. Some still wore pieces of their Africa Corps uniforms, that distinctive tan color faded from Texas sun and countless cycles through camp laundry until it was almost khaki. The insignia removed per camp regulations, but the cut and style still unmistakably German military. They moved with military precision, straight lines. Proper spacing, synchronized movement until they reached the threshold of the library. Then they hesitated collectively, as if crossing into this particular room required a different kind of courage than crossing minefields or advancing under artillery fire. She counted them as they entered, matching faces to names on her list, through small identifying details. The man with the distinctive scar across his left eyebrow running from temple to hairline like a pale lightning bolt, that would be Victor Steiner, the one Brennan had warned her about. The younger one with curious eyes who couldn't stop looking at the shelves, drinking in the sight of so many books, Franz Lehmann, 24 years old, listed as corporal in the 24th Panzer Division captured in Tunisia. The tall one with intelligent features who held himself slightly apart from the others, observing everything with an analytical expression, Heinrich Adler, 28, listed as former teacher from Munich, captured at El Alamein during Rommel's final retreat. They sat in the chairs she'd arranged in a rough semicircle, no desks, no barriers, nothing to hide behind except air and mutual suspicion and 3 years of war. She wanted to see their faces clearly, watch their eyes for signs of genuine engagement or resistance. Read the subtle shifts in posture that would tell her what they were really thinking beneath whatever masks they wore for safety or pride or habit. She waited until they'd fully settled, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become slightly uncomfortable but not unbearable. The room had gone completely still except for small sounds, men breathing, fabric shifting, someone clearing his throat nervously. 20 pairs of eyes watching her with expressions ranging from genuine curiosity to deep suspicion, to something that looked remarkably like fear. When she spoke in German from the very first word. Not English with translation, not apologetic explanation. Just German, her grandmother's Bavarian inflections coloring the formal High German she'd learned from books and university courses. My name is Rosalind Ashford. I am your education officer for this program. This library contains 5,000 books covering every subject from ancient Greek philosophy to modern American literature. Many of these books are books your government burned in public ceremonies starting in 1933. Many of them are books that would have gotten you imprisoned or killed for possessing in Germany. Here in this room, you are free to read them all, every single volume. She watched the words land, saw the small reactions ripple through the group like stones dropped in still water. A widening of eyes here, a tightening of jaw there. Someone in the back row inhaling sharply audibly. The young one, Franz, leaned forward slightly in his chair, his whole body suggesting interest despite obvious efforts to maintain a neutral expression. Victor in the front row remained perfectly motionless, his face unreadable as carved granite. But she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical pressure. Why? The question came from the back row. An older man than most of the others, perhaps 40, his face weathered and hard, his uniform bearing faded insignia that marked him as a senior non-commissioned officer. Why would Americans let enemies read anything at all? Why not simply keep us locked up with minimum food and shelter until the war ends and then ship us home? Why waste resources on education? Because, she said, choosing each word carefully as if placing pieces in a complex puzzle. We believe that educated men are harder to deceive than ignorant ones, because we believe you have the right to think for yourselves even if your government didn't believe that. Because we believe that books are more powerful than bombs when it comes to building the kind of peace that actually lasts beyond a single generation. Propaganda. Victor's voice from the front row was flat factual, as if he were simply stating an obvious truth everyone already knew. American propaganda designed to make us ashamed of serving our country, to make us doubt our beliefs and our comrades, to turn us into traitors who collaborate with the enemy against our own people, psychological warfare dressed up as education. Perhaps, she acknowledged, meeting his eyes directly and refusing to look away despite the hostility she saw there. Or perhaps your leaders called everything propaganda because they feared what you might learn if you were allowed to read freely and think independently. Because controlling what people read is the essential first step in controlling what they think. And controlling what they think is how you control what they do, what they believe, what they're willing to die for. She moved to the shelf with deliberate slowness, pulled down. All quiet on the Western Front held it up so every man in the room could see the cover, clearly plain binding author's name title that had become synonymous with anti-war literature. This book was written by a German soldier named Erich Maria Remarque, about German soldiers, about the Great War that killed millions, written in German, published in Germany, read by millions of your countrymen before your government banned it and burned every copy they could find. Why? Silence. But she could feel them thinking, see the minute shifts of expression that indicated they were actually considering the question instead of just dismissing it reflexively. Shall I read you what they were so afraid of you knowing? More silence, but this time it felt different. Expectant rather than hostile, curious rather than defensive. A silence that listened. She opened to a passage she'd marked carefully, one of the sections she'd chosen for its devastating simplicity, its refusal to glorify or romanticize war, its stark honesty about what combat actually does to human beings who have to endure it. She began to read her German fluent and natural, the words flowing like water, finding its natural level. Remarques prose about the absolute futility of war, about young men sent to die for old men's ambitions they didn't understand, about watching friends torn apart by artillery while you crouched in mud hoping the shell with your name on it hadn't been fired yet. About the humanity that somehow persists even in hell. Even when everything else has been stripped away, even when you've been reduced to animal survival and desperate hope. When she finished, she closed the book carefully, reverently, as if it were something sacred that required respectful handling. Set it on her desk like a precious object. This is what your government didn't want you to read. A German soldier, one of your own, a man who fought in trenches just like you fought in deserts, telling the truth about what war actually costs, about what it does to the men who survive it, about what gets lost that can never be recovered. You tell me why they were so afraid of these particular words that they burned every copy they could find and banned it throughout the Reich. The young one in the third row spoke, his voice soft and uncertain but genuine, carrying no trace of the aggressive defensiveness she'd expected. Because it might make us question things. Question what specifically? Whether dying for the fatherland is always noble and necessary. Whether following orders is always the right thing to do. Whether... He stopped abruptly, glanced nervously at Victor, then continued anyway with visible effort, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Whether we were lied to about what war would be like, what it would mean, what it would cost us. Victor turned his head slowly to glare at the young man with an expression of pure contempt, mixed with something else, perhaps disappointment, perhaps threat. The young prisoner's eyes dropped immediately to the floor, his momentary courage evaporating under that hostile stare, his shoulders curling inward protectively. "In this room," Rosalind said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension, to redirect attention away from the frightened young man and back to her where it belonged. "You are free to question everything. That is not weakness, that is not disloyalty to your comrades or betrayal of men who died. That is intelligence. That is what separates thinking human beings from trained animals who simply obey. That is what it means to use the mind you were given instead of letting others use it for you." She set Remarque's book on her desk with deliberate care, then selected another from the shelf, The Magic Mountain. Thomas Mann's 800-page masterwork that she'd read 3 times and understood differently each time, finding new layers with every reading. Thomas Mann, perhaps the greatest German writer of the 20th century, possibly of any century, exiled by Hitler in 1933, his books burned in public ceremonies, his citizenship officially revoked, his family scattered across continents. Why? Not because he advocated violence or revolution, not because he was a communist or a socialist or even particularly political, but because he wrote about ideas, because he believed in complexity and ambiguity, because he thought young people should think for themselves instead of being told what to think by a government that claimed to know better than they possibly could. She held the thick book out toward them like an offering or a challenge. They could decide which. Who wants to read it? No hands rose. The prisoners sat frozen between competing desires, caught in the trap of wanting to know, but being terrified of the consequences of knowing, wanting to reach for forbidden knowledge, but afraid of what it might mean to actually grasp it, to hold it, to let it change them. No volunteers. She kept her voice light, almost conversational, as if this were an ordinary classroom in an ordinary school discussing ordinary literature instead of a battlefield where ideologies fought for the survival of souls. Then let me tell you what you'll find inside this particular book if you're brave enough to read it. You'll find questions about duty versus individualism, about what we owe to society and what we owe to ourselves as unique human beings, about whether following orders is always right or whether there are times when disobedience becomes the highest form of loyalty to human values, about whether dying for an abstract idea is noble sacrifice or foolish waste, about whether the life you've been told to live is the only life worth living or whether there might be other possibilities you've never been allowed to consider. She paused deliberately, letting the words settle into the silence like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. Or you can refuse to read it. You can sit in this library surrounded by 5,000 books, surrounded by accumulated human wisdom and experience and insight, and deliberately choose ignorance. That's your right as human beings with free will and individual agency. We won't force you. We won't punish you for refusing. That's the fundamental difference between here and the Germany you left behind, between democracy and what you served, between freedom and control. The silence stretched taut as wire about to snap, vibrating with tension so thick it felt almost visible. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as if he were fighting his own hand. Franz Lehmann raised his arm. The gesture was small, tentative, his hand rising only to shoulder height, as if he were afraid to commit fully to the act of volunteering. But it was there, visible, impossible to unsee. "What's your name?" Rosalind asked gently, though she already knew from her memorized list. "Franz Lehmann, ma'am, Corporal, 24th Panzer Division, 2nd Company." "How old are you, Franz?" "24, ma'am." 24 years old. The same age Colonel Brennan's son had been when he died at Kasserine Pass. The same age as millions of young men on every side who'd been fed into the industrial machinery of total war and emerged dead or broken or so fundamentally changed by what they'd seen and done that they could never be whole again. She walked over slowly and handed him the book, and she could see his hands shaking slightly as he took it from her. Could see what this simple act cost him. The courage required to be first, to mark himself as different, to reach for forbidden knowledge in front of 20 other prisoners, including Victor Steiner, who was now staring at him with an expression of cold calculation that promised future consequences. "Read the first 50 pages by our next class on Thursday," she said clearly, making sure everyone in the room heard, establishing that this was now official, that Franz had committed himself publicly and she had accepted that commitment. "Come prepared to discuss them. I'll expect you to have questions, observations, thoughts about what man is trying to say about time and society and individual human experience." Another hand rose, this one more confident, belonging to an older prisoner near the back. Then another. Then two more simultaneously, as if permission had finally been granted. By the time the first session ended an hour later, 15 of the 20 prisoners had selected books from her shelves. Some choosing the same titles as Franz: Safety in Numbers, Solidarity Against Whatever Consequences Might Come. Others picking different volumes as if determined to establish their own independent paths of inquiry. The other 5, including Victor Steiner, had sat in rigid silence throughout the entire session, their absolute refusal to participate a form of resistance as clear and unmistakable as if they'd stood up and shouted their defiance. After they filed out, moving with the same military precision they'd entered, with boots striking floor in unconscious unison. Rosalind stood alone again among her arsenal of ideas. Her hands had stopped trembling at some point during the past hour without her noticing exactly when. Something fundamental had shifted. Some door had opened just a crack, not wide enough to call it victory, far too early for that kind of dangerous pride, but enough to let in a sliver of light where before there had been only darkness and uncertainty. Not certainty, not yet, but possibility. The first small seed of transformation planted in soil that might or might not prove fertile enough to sustain growth. The morning continued. Second group at 10 o'clock, third at 11. Each session a variation on the same essential theme with different faces and slightly different dynamics. Curiosity warring with years of indoctrination. The hunger for knowledge they'd been denied, fighting against the safety of beliefs they'd been taught since childhood. Some prisoners eager, almost desperately eager, for books they'd never been allowed to touch. Some resistant, clinging to ideological certainty. Because doubt was too terrifying to contemplate, because questioning meant facing what they might have done, what they might have been, part of what they might have to acknowledge about themselves. All of them watching her with eyes that contained more complexity than propaganda had allowed her to imagine. More humanity, more struggle between what they'd been taught and what some part of them suspected might actually be true. By noon, she'd taught 60 prisoners. By week's end, she would meet all 180 volunteers. But it was that first group that stayed with her, specifically Franz Lehmann, the young corporal who'd raised his hand first despite visible fear, and Victor Steiner, who'd sat like judgment incarnate in the front row, whose refusal to participate had somehow been more present and powerful than the participation of those who'd actually selected books. That evening, after her final class, after the sun had started its winter descent, she remained alone in the library even though it was officially closed. The December light came through the windows at that particular low angle that only happens near the solstice, turning ordinary dust into gold, making the room feel almost sacred, like a church or temple or some other space deliberately set apart for transformation. She sat at her desk and took out Owen's envelope one final time for the day. Held it in both hands, felt its weight, just a few sheets of paper. But they felt heavier than physics could explain, as if grief itself had mass that could be measured in ounces and pounds. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would find the courage to open it and face whatever truth lay inside. But tonight she'd done something that felt impossible just yesterday. She'd stood before 20 enemy soldiers and offered them books their government had tried to destroy. She'd watched the first cracks appear in carefully constructed ideological armor. She'd planted seeds of doubt and question and independent thought. Tomorrow could wait one more day for its truths. She put the envelope back and locked the desk drawer. Outside, the Texas evening was falling, and in barracks across the compound, 180 German prisoners were beginning to discover that thinking for yourself was both harder and more valuable than anyone had ever told them. And that for now would have to be enough. December became rhythm. Classes at 8, 10, and 2 like breathing. Discussion groups Tuesday and Thursday where prisoners debated ideas they'd never been allowed to question. English lessons Monday, Wednesday, Friday for those preparing for a different future. The library filled and emptied, 180 prisoners cycling through in groups of 20, each man carrying questions he'd been forbidden to ask his entire adult life. Franz Lehmann finished The Magic Mountain in 9 days despite its 800 pages. He appeared at her office door on a gray December morning holding the book like something precious. "I need another, ma'am." No preamble, just urgency. Something harder. Something that will help me understand how I became what I became. "What did you become, Franz?" He met her eyes without flinching. "A Nazi, ma'am. Not just a soldier following orders, a believer. Someone who thought eliminating inferior races was necessary, right, justified." He paused. "I need to understand how that happens to a person. How a normal boy who liked football and wanted to be an engineer turns into someone who would have pulled the trigger without hesitation and felt righteous doing it." She gave him Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Every book she could find about the banality of evil and the human capacity for self-deception. He consumed them with desperate intensity, as if understanding might somehow constitute absolution. Victor Steiner still came to every class without fail, still sat front row with arms crossed and face carved from stone, still refused to speak except to challenge, to remind the room that resistance remained possible. "These books," he said one Tuesday afternoon, cutting through discussion like a blade, "are designed to make us ashamed, to turn us into traitors, but some of us remember what duty means." Rosalind met his eyes across the room. "What does duty mean, Victor? Loyalty, sacrifice, doing what's hard because it's right, even when what's hard is murder." The room went silent. Victor's jaw tightened. "Soldiers follow orders. That's what distinguishes armies from armed mobs. And when the orders are evil, who decides what's evil?" His voice rose slightly, passion breaking through the stone facade. "You America victors write history. If Germany had won, we'd be teaching you to question your beliefs." He had a point, terrible but valid. Some prisoners nodded. "You're right," she said, and watched surprise flash across his face. "Victors do write history, but that doesn't make all versions equally true. Genocide is evil regardless of who wins, not because I say so, because it violates the basic principle that makes us human." "What principle?" "That we recognize each other's humanity." She leaned forward. "Your ideology required you to stop seeing Jews as human. That's what made genocide possible. That's what made it evil." Victor stood abruptly. "Permission to leave." "Denied. Sit down." He remained standing. The moment stretched, taut, 20 men holding their breath. "Sit down, Victor." He sat slowly, deliberately, but his eyes promised this wasn't over. After class, Colonel Brennan waited in her office. "I heard. Well handled. Was it felt like barely holding the room together?" "You did barely hold it, but you held it." He paused. "I want to introduce someone useful to your work." A man entered, 28, lean, intelligent eyes taking in everything. Heinrich Adler, literature teacher from Munich before the war, captured at El Alamein. There's a complication. Heinrich spoke in careful English. I'm what they call a premature anti-fascist, ma'am. I opposed Hitler before the war, was forced to serve anyway. The other prisoners don't trust me, think I'm a collaborator. Are you? She asked directly. I want Germany to become something better than what it's been. If that makes me a collaborator, yes. He met her eyes. I taught the books you teach, remarked Man Brecht. Then they were burned and I was ordered to teach only approved material. I refused. They sent me to the front as punishment. After Brennan left, Heinrich remained. Why join the program? To help others see what I see, that we were lied to, that we served evil, that we have choices now about what we become. He paused. I failed my students before. I taught them to think but not to be brave. So when time came to resist, they followed instead. I won't fail again. Rosalind understood that guilt intimately. There's something else, Heinrich said, expression darkening. Victor leads a group enforcing ideological purity. They threaten prisoners who attend classes too enthusiastically, beat men who check out books. Last week they broke fingers of a prisoner learning English. Does Brennan know? Yes, he's letting it play out. Thinks the program works better if prisoners choose transformation despite threats. Heinrich's jaw tightened. I think someone will die before this ends. A knock interrupted. A black soldier stood at the door, late 20s, Sergeant Stripes' controlled expression. Ma'am, Sergeant Elijah Carver, Colonel asked me to deliver this. He held out a folder. She took it, noting how his eyes moved to Heinrich. Enemy and guard in the same room. Thank you, Sergeant. He turned to leave, then paused. Ma'am, if I may, something you should know about the town. Go ahead. I was in Herne yesterday. Tried to get lunch at Miller's Diner. They wouldn't serve me. Said they don't serve coloreds. His voice remained level. Then I watched 3 German prisoners walk in and get served just fine. Enemy soldiers eating where an American sergeant who guards them isn't welcome. The words hung like accusation. Heinrich shifted uncomfortably. Rosalind felt shame flood through her. America's hypocrisy laid bare. That's wrong, Sergeant. I'm sorry. But it is that way, ma'am. I guard men treated better than I am. Just thought you should know since you're teaching them about freedom and democracy. He left before she could respond. Heinrich spoke softly. In Germany, we were told America practiced racial purity through segregation, that Americans understood keeping races separate but wouldn't admit it. That made you hypocrites, not weak, just dishonest about what you believed. And now I think both countries were wrong. That racial hierarchy is evil, whether you call it Aryan supremacy or segregation. He met her eyes. And I think you're trying to teach us to be better than our countries have been, which makes you very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Christmas approached like a storm. Herne mobilized with impossible generosity. American Legion fundraisers, church gift drives, Lions Club collections, women knitting socks, children making cards, every household contributing for men who'd been trying to kill their sons. Vivian Whitmore appeared at Rosalind's office, 42, elegant despite wartime privation, dark hair silvering at temples. We want to sing for the prisoners. German Christmas carols in German, Christmas Eve. Her son Michael, 22, was in Italy. No word for 8 weeks. Why show that kindness? Vivian sat without asking, composure cracking. Because if German soldiers show kindness to my boy, maybe he'll survive. Because kindness is contagious. Because I'm terrified and this is the only thing I can control. Her voice wavered. Because I need to believe we can still be human to each other. That if I sing for their sons, maybe someone shows compassion to mine. Your son is probably dead. 8 weeks without a letter. Fighting in Italy is brutal. She said it flatly. But until I know, I'm going to sing, because that's the only bargain with fate I have left. Rosalind understood that desperate bargaining. They spent 3 afternoons together, Rosalind coaching Vivian through Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum. Vivian's voice was beautiful, though it wavered on words that must have reminded her of Michael. The week before Christmas, violence erupted. Franz arrived early one morning, face bruised, purple and yellow, right hand wrapped in bandages, fingers swollen at wrong angles. He was reshelving books one-handed. "Franz, what happened?" "Nothing, ma'am." "That's not nothing." He set down books carefully. "Victor and his friends, last night after lights out, said I was betraying the fatherland, that men like me will be dealt with when we return home." He looked at his damaged hand. This was a warning. Rage flooded her. "I'm reporting this immediately." "No." Sharp. "Please. That makes it worse. Victor will say it was an accident. I'll be labeled a coward who runs to Americans. I'll lose credibility with others who are questioning." "They broke your hand. They can break my fingers but can't make me stop thinking. Once you start questioning, you can't stop. It's like reading. Once you learn, you can't unknow how." Heinrich appeared, took in the injuries with one glance. "Victor." Franz nodded. "He's desperate," Heinrich said. "Sees ideology slipping away, more prisoners choosing books over loyalty. He's trying to terrorize everyone back into line. Will it work? No. Fear only works when people have nothing stronger to hold on to. Knowledge gives you something worth being afraid for. Franz's broken fingers prove what we're learning matters enough to be dangerous." That night, Rosalind finally opened Owen's letter. Hands shaking, she slid her finger under the seal. His handwriting was rushed, uneven. "My dearest Roz, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. I'm sorry. I wanted to grow old with you. Children and Sunday mornings and all the ordinary beautiful things we dreamed about. But more than anything, if I don't survive, don't let my death fill you with hatred. Don't let it make you small. The world needs fewer people who know how to hate and more who remember how to love. Find purpose in peace, not revenge. Find meaning in preventing the next war. Find a way to live that makes my death mean something more than just another casualty. I love you. Loved you from the moment you quoted Yeats at that faculty party. Love you now wherever I am. Love is stronger than war, Roz. Please remember that. Please prove it true. Always yours. Owen." She read it 3 times, folded it carefully, then allowed herself to cry deep, racking sobs. For Owen lost in the Pacific, for Franz beaten for learning, for Carver refused service, for Vivian singing while her son might be dying, for all of them caught between cruelty and grief. Love is stronger than war. She wanted to believe it, needed to. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. 4,800 prisoners assembled in the recreation hall. 4,800 wrapped gifts waiting, one for each man. Vivian's choir stood at front, 20 women in Sunday best holding songbooks with German phonetically spelled. Franz sat rows back, hand bandaged. Victor sat in the corner with his loyalist's face set in contempt. Vivian stepped forward. Rosalind translated as she spoke. "My name is Vivian Whitmore. My son Michael is 22, serving in Italy. I haven't heard from him in 8 weeks. I don't know if he's alive." Her voice caught. "But somewhere there might be a mother like me praying for her son the way I pray for mine. I choose to believe kindness to each other's sons might protect them both. So tonight I sing for you. And I pray someone is singing for my son." She began Stille Nacht. Her voice filled the hall clear and true. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, 20 American voices singing in German for enemies. Franz was crying openly. Heinrich bowed his head. Victor sat perfectly still, hands gripping knees, white-knuckled. But something was cracking in his eyes, some barrier between ideology and humanity beginning to fracture. The song ended. One prisoner stood, then another. Then all 4,800 rose in respect, not for America, but for a mother's courage. Gifts were distributed. Franz opened his. "From the Thompson family. Our son James died at Normandy. We give you this in his memory, hoping you'll help build a peace that keeps the next generation from dying." He held it like something sacred, tears streaming down his face. After the ceremony, Rosalind found Victor outside, staring at his package as if it might explode. "Why?" he asked. "We killed their sons. We believed they were inferior. That mercy was weakness to exploit. And now I don't know what I believe." For the first time, she saw past ideology to the terrified young man beneath. The woman who sang her son is fighting in Italy. Yes, she doesn't know if he's alive. No, but she sang for us anyway. He was quiet for a long moment. "I had a mother, in Hamburg, died in the firebombing last July, 53 years old, never hurt anyone in her life. I'm sorry. Just tell me, do you really believe people can change, that men like me can become something different?" "Yes, because you're already changing. The fact you're asking means the ideology is cracking." He nodded slowly, still clutching his package, then walked away into the Texas night. 3 days after Christmas, Vivian appeared at Rosalind's office, trembling violently, carrying a telegram. "He's alive." She could barely speak. "Michael, the Red Cross found him. He was captured by German forces near Monte Cassino 3 weeks ago. They're holding him in a POW camp in northern Italy." She collapsed into the chair, tears streaming. "The telegram says he's receiving adequate treatment, medical care, Red Cross packages. The Germans are showing him mercy, the same mercy I tried to show their sons." The impossible bargain had held. Kindness for kindness, mercy for mercy. "It worked," Vivian whispered. "I showed compassion to their sons, and they're showing compassion to mine. Maybe that's how we survive this. How we stay human when everything pushes us toward becoming monsters." New Year came. January brought cold rain. The program continued. More prisoners joined. More books were read. More transformations occurred in the space between question and answer, doubt and certainty. Then in early February, the Red Cross telegram arrived that would change everything. Rosalind was teaching when Brennan entered, carrying an envelope with the Red Cross symbol. His expression was carefully controlled. "Miss Ashford, a word, now." They stepped into the hallway. He handed her the envelope. "It's about your husband. They found him." The world tilted. "Is he alive, Rosalind?" "He's alive." Brennan's voice was gentle. "He was captured after his plane went down. He's been in a Japanese POW camp near Manila for 6 months. The Red Cross just established contact. He's coming home." She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only stand there while reality rearranged itself around this impossible fact. Owen was alive. Joy flooded through her, so intense it felt like pain, like her chest might crack open from the force of it. "Congratulations," Brennan said quietly. "I know this is what you've been waiting for." After he left, she stood in the hallway holding the telegram with shaking hands. Through the library door, she could see her students waiting. Franz with his healing hand, Heinrich reading ahead, even Victor, who'd started participating tentatively, his certainty crumbling piece by piece. Owen had written, "Find purpose in preventing the next war." She was doing that. Here, with these men, teaching them to think, to question, to recognize humanity in enemies. And now Owen was coming home. She would figure out who she was as both wife and educator. The answer wasn't binary. She could be both, had to be both. Because the war had changed them both in ways that couldn't be undone. She walked back into the library, carrying her joy like a secret treasure. "Apologies for the interruption. Let's continue. Kant's categorical imperative: could genocide become universal law? Could systematic extermination become a principle for all humanity?" 20 pairs of eyes watched her. Franz raised his healed hand. "No, ma'am. None of those things could become universal law. Because if everyone practiced genocide, there would be no one left to be human to. The world would destroy itself." Victor's hand went up slowly, reluctantly, but up. "Yes, Victor. I agree with Franz," he said quietly, and the admission seemed to drain something essential from him. "I wish I didn't. It would be easier if I still believed what I was taught for 12 years. But I can't anymore. The American mother singing while her son fights us. The people giving gifts to enemies who'd killed their sons. Your sergeant refused service while we're welcomed. Vivian's son shown mercy by German soldiers. He paused. Nothing is simple anymore, and I'm tired of pretending it is. Good, Rosalind said, meaning it with her whole heart. Because the world isn't simple, Victor. Anyone who offers easy answers in clear categories is lying. Truth is always complicated, always messy, always harder than propaganda makes it seem. The class continued. Outside, the Texas sun moved across the winter sky. Inside, surrounded by enemy soldiers learning to think for themselves, something impossible was happening. Love was proving stronger than war. Not through sentiment, but through stubborn daily choice to see humanity in enemies. To educate instead of punish. To plant seeds of peace in blood-soaked soil and hope they would somehow grow. And somewhere in the Pacific, Owen was coming home. The transformation continued. One question, one book, one act of radical kindness at a time. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Arrived not with triumph, but with silence. The kind that settles when endings come, but cost far more than anyone imagined. Rosalind stood in Camp Hearn's recreation hall as the radio announcement echoed through speakers mounted on walls. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. American guards cheered and embraced. Some cried openly, others simply stood processing the magnitude of survival. The German prisoners sat in rows, 4,800 men whose world had just ended. Some stared at the floor as if answers might be found in worn wood. Some wept quietly, shoulders shaking. Others sat rigid with blank faces, retreating to wherever minds go when reality becomes unbearable. Franz buried his face in his hands, his whole body convulsing with silent sobs. Heinrich sat perfectly still, tears tracking down his face unchecked. Victor stood abruptly and walked out, shoulders shaking, finally broken. The war was over, but reckoning had just begun. In the days that followed, Colonel Brennan assembled all prisoners for mandatory viewings. Newsreel footage had arrived from Europe, grainy black and white films of what American and Soviet troops had found when they liberated the concentration camps. Rosalind watched from the side of the hall as the projector flickered to life. She'd already seen these images in Brennan's office. Nothing could have prepared her. Nothing could prepare anyone. The screen filled with horrors beyond language. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. Mountains of skeletal corpses stacked like cordwood because there were too many dead to bury individually. Living skeletons with eyes too large for shrunken faces, their bodies showing every bone, every rib, every vertebra visible beneath skin stretched tight. Gas chambers disguised as showers, the walls still stained. Ovens designed for mass cremation still full of ash and fragments of human bone. Mass graves being excavated by bulldozers because human hands couldn't possibly move that much death. The narrator's voice was clinical, factual, but the images spoke their own terrible truth. This was not propaganda, this was not exaggeration, this was what the Reich had built, what German soldiers had protected with their obedience, what 12 years of Nazi ideology had produced when taken to its logical conclusion. The prisoners watched in complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sounds were the projector's mechanical whir and occasional stifled sobs that men tried desperately to suppress. Franz vomited into his hands, then stumbled outside, unable to continue watching. Heinrich sat frozen, his face gray as ash, staring at the screen without blinking, as if forcing himself to witness every second. Other prisoners turned away or covered their faces, but the MPs kept everyone seated, kept everyone watching, ensuring no one could escape this reckoning. And Victor. Victor stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the front of the hall. He positioned himself 3 feet from the screen, forcing himself to look directly at it. Forcing himself to see every detail with unflinching attention. Every skeletal face, every pile of corpses, every child's shoe collected in mountains of leather evidence. Every wedding ring and boxes of gold pulled from murdered mouths. He stood there for the entire 40-minute reel, never looking away, never flinching, his hands clenched at his sides so tightly his fingernails drew blood from his palms. When the reel finally ended and the lights came up, no one moved. 4,800 men sat in the wreckage of everything they'd believed, everything they'd been taught, everything that had given their lives meaning and purpose. For 12 years. Colonel Brennan stood at the front, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. You served the regime that did this. Some of you knew, some of you suspected, some of you were genuinely ignorant, but all of you wore the uniform that protected these camps. All of you followed orders that led to this. All of you participated in a system that produced this horror. And now you have to decide what you do with that knowledge. He paused, letting silence settle heavy. You're going home soon. Germany is destroyed. Your cities are rubble. Your families are starving. Your country will need to be rebuilt from absolutely nothing, from less than nothing, from the ashes of what you created, and you have a choice. You can rebuild it the same way it was before, with the same ideologies that led to this. Or you can build something genuinely different, something that ensures this never happens again. The education program here was designed to give you tools for that rebuilding. Whether you use them is entirely up to you. After the viewing, Rosalind found Victor outside, sitting on the ground with his back against the barracks wall. His face was gray, his hands shook uncontrollably. He looked like a man who'd just watched his soul incinerate. She sat beside him without speaking. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response to devastation. After a long time, he spoke barely above a whisper. We didn't know. I swear to you on everything I have left, I didn't know it was like that. Not the scale, not the systematic efficiency, not the children. Some part of you knew, she said quietly, carefully. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full horror, but you knew Jews were being rounded up. You knew they were being sent east. You knew they weren't coming back. You chose not to ask questions about what was happening to them. Yes, his voice cracked completely. Yes, I chose not to know. Because knowing would have required action. Action would have required courage, and I didn't have courage. I only had obedience. I only had certainty that following orders was always right. He stopped, covered his face with shaking hands. My brother joined the SS, volunteered eagerly. He used to talk about the necessity of eliminating inferior races like it was just simple biology, scientific fact. And I didn't argue with him, I just stayed quiet. Let him believe it, because arguing meant conflict, and I hated conflict more than I hated the things he was saying. Your brother was wrong, profoundly evil wrong, but you're not him. Aren't I? He looked at her with eyes full of agony. I wore the same uniform, served the same regime. The only difference is he acted on beliefs I was too cowardly to challenge. That makes me complicit. That makes me guilty. Rosalind had no comfort to offer that wouldn't be a lie. Then be different now. You can't undo what you didn't do then. You can't go back and be brave when bravery mattered most, but you can choose what you do next. Go home, rebuild, teach. Make absolutely certain the next generation knows what happens when people stay silent while evil is being done in their name. Will that be enough? Can teaching children about the Holocaust somehow balance what I enabled through my silence? I don't know, probably not, but it's more than continued silence, and maybe that has to be enough. Owen came home in late September, 4 weeks after Japan surrendered following the atomic bombs. The liberation of POW camps across the Pacific had taken weeks. He'd spent that time in a Manila hospital regaining enough strength for the long journey home. He wasn't the Owen who'd left. He stepped off the train in San Antonio wearing a borrowed uniform that hung on his frame, having lost 35 pounds he would never fully regain. His face was gaunt, aged beyond his 30 years, carrying shadows that would never completely lift. But when he smiled, that same crooked smile she'd fallen in love with, he was still Owen, broken but present, changed but somehow still himself. They held each other on the platform while trains arrived and departed, and other reunions happened around them in the golden September light. You got my letter, he said against her hair, his voice hoarse from months of malnutrition. In December. I didn't open it until Christmas. Did it help? Yes and no, and yes again. She pulled back to look at his face, this familiar, strange face that was his but different. You told me to find purpose in preventing the next war. I've been trying. I've been doing exactly that. They went to her small apartment. He looked around at the life she'd built without him, books everywhere. Papers covering every surface, photographs pinned to walls showing prisoners who'd transformed from enemies to students. Tell me, he said simply. Tell me everything. So she did. All of it. The library and the 5,000 books. Franz and Heinrich and Victor. The Christmas when an entire town gave gifts to men who'd been trying to kill their sons. Vivian singing German carols while her own son was a prisoner in Italy. The concentration camp footage and the complete ideological collapse that followed. The small daily miracles of minds learning to question after years of being trained only to obey. He listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. Do you want to stop? He finally asked, voice careful. Now that I'm home, do you want to come back to Philadelphia? Be a wife again instead of a teacher of German prisoners? The question she'd been dreading for months. No, she said, and felt the rightness of it even as she feared his reaction. I don't want to stop. This work matters, Owen. Maybe more than anything I've ever done. These men are going home to rebuild Germany from ashes. What they rebuild, what they teach their children, will determine whether our children fight another war in 20 years. Then don't stop. She looked at him surprised. You're not angry. You don't want your wife back. I'm not the same man who left in April of 43. You're not the same woman I married. He took her hand gently. The war changed us both into people our younger selves wouldn't recognize. But I spent 18 months in that camp. You know what kept me alive when men around me were dying of starvation and disease, not hatred. Not thoughts of revenge, but the belief that somewhere in this war someone was showing mercy, that maybe someone was treating a German prisoner with the same humanity I hoped someone would show me. His voice roughened. You're doing exactly what I hoped someone would do. You're treating enemies like human beings. You're planting seeds for lasting peace instead of just celebrating military victory. How could I possibly ask you to stop? How could I be angry that my wife is trying to save the world, one German prisoner at a time? What about us? What about our marriage? We figure it out, together. Isn't that what marriage means? Figuring out the impossible things together even when neither of us has answers. The repatriation orders came in late September. Final preparations began immediately. Rosalind spent those final weeks preparing her students for return to a country that no longer existed as they'd known it, teaching practical skills for survival, how to organize civil administration in destroyed cities, how to implement democratic principles in a culture with no democratic tradition, how to teach children a completely different way when everyone who might teach them had been educated under the Reich, how to feed starving populations with almost no infrastructure remaining. She taught them everything she could compress into the remaining time, knowing it wouldn't be nearly enough, but doing it anyway because not doing it wasn't an option. The last class was in early November. All 180 prisoners assembled in the library one final time, the room where transformation had begun, where forbidden questions had first been asked, where minds had learned to think instead of just obey. Heinrich stood to speak first, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. I came to this camp believing I was alone in my opposition to fascism, that I was the only German who'd seen through the lies. I leave knowing there are dozens like me just in this camp. Hundreds across all the POW camps in America, thousands across Germany who stayed silent during the war but won't be silent during the rebuilding. We were cowards when courage mattered most, but we won't be cowards anymore. Franz spoke next, holding himself with new dignity earned through pain. I came here believing what I'd been taught since I was 12 years old, that some races were superior to others, that obedience was the highest virtue, that questioning was weakness, that Germany's destiny was to rule. I leave believing the exact opposite of everything I once knew. and I'll spend the rest of my life, however long that is, teaching German children what I learned here, that thinking is stronger than obeying, that humanity transcends race, that kindness is not weakness but the hardest form of courage, that the truth is always complicated and anyone who offers simple answers is lying. Victor was last. He stood slowly as if the act required immense effort. I don't have pretty words to offer. I can't claim I've been transformed into something good or redeemed. The things I enabled through my silence and obedience can't be undone with book learning and good intentions. But I can say this. I came here absolutely certain of my beliefs, my ideology, my understanding of the world and Germany's place in it. I leave uncertain about everything, and maybe that uncertainty is better than the kind of certainty that leads to gas chambers. Maybe doubt is the only honest response to what we've learned. Maybe questions are more valuable than answers when the answers we had led to genocide. He looked directly at Rosalind. You gave us books when you could have given us nothing. You gave us dignity when we deserved only contempt. You gave us the chance to become something other than what 12 years of Nazi education had made us. Some of us took that chance. Some didn't. Some are still resisting even now. But all of us had the opportunity. That's more than we gave our victims. That's more grace than we had any right to expect. The prisoners filed out one by one, each stopping to shake Rosalind's hand or say goodbye in German that carried weight beyond simple words. Some left books they'd kept their margins filled with notes and questions and insights. Others left small gifts carved from wood or braided from string during evening hours. Tangible evidence that something had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Heinrich was last. He handed her a thick journal, its pages covered in dense German script, months of careful observation compressed into permanent record. My account of everything that happened here, he said simply. Everything I witnessed, everything I learned, everything that transformed us. I want you to have it, so you know the true impact of what you did, so you have evidence when people inevitably claim this program failed or that transformation isn't possible. Did it fail? She asked, needing his honest assessment. No. According to the exit surveys, 74% of us support democracy now. 61% support American aid for German reconstruction. 38% want to immigrate to America legally someday if given the chance. Those aren't failure numbers, Mrs. Ashford. That's unprecedented success in ideological transformation. And the other 26%? Some people can't be reached. Some ideologies are too deeply rooted in identity. Some men will die believing what they've always believed. He paused. But we saved most of us. That has to count for something. It has to mean something. They left in early December. Trucks to the train station, trains to the port in New York, ships across the Atlantic to Bremen and Hamburg, back to a Germany that existed now only in ruins and memory, and the massive task of rebuilding from nothing. Rosalind stood at the camp gate and watched them go. 180 men she'd taught to think for themselves. 180 possible futures for a broken country. 180 seeds planted in blood-soaked soil, hoping desperately that some would take root and grow into something that might prevent the next catastrophe. Decades passed like pages turning in an accelerated film. Rosalind and Owen spent 3 years in occupied Germany establishing schools and libraries and education programs across the American zone, teaching German teachers how to teach democracy to students who'd never known it, teaching administrators how to run cities without fascist principles, teaching children that their parents had been profoundly wrong about nearly everything. They came home in 1949, settled in Virginia near Washington, had 2 children who grew up knowing their parents had helped rebuild a shattered world. Built a life that looked ordinary on the surface but carried underneath all the weight of what they'd surveyed and witnessed and accomplished. Rosalind taught literature at a women's college, wrote articles about post-war education and cultural transformation, consulted with the State Department on exchange programs between America and the Federal Republic of Germany. Lived quietly but purposefully her days. filled with students and books and the same fundamental questions about humanity she'd been asking since 1943. Owen worked for NASA in its early years, designed systems for the Mercury and Gemini programs, flew recreationally on weekends because he couldn't stay completely away from the sky even after it had almost killed him. They received letters over the years, from Heinrich, who became mayor of a small city in Bavaria and sent Christmas cards every December without fail. From Franz, who taught literature in Hamburg and named his daughter Rosalind in honor of the woman who'd taught him to think. From others whose names she'd half forgotten, but whose words reminded her that transformation had been real, not imagined, not propaganda about propaganda. Even Victor wrote once in 1965, a short letter on thin airmail paper. Dear Mrs. Ashford, I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it and wouldn't know what to do with it if offered. But I wanted you to know that I became a school principal in West Berlin. I teach German children about the Holocaust, about responsibility and complicity, about the cost of silence when evil is being done. I don't tell them I was one of the silent ones, but I teach them with absolute conviction not to be what I was. Your library saved whatever was salvageable of my humanity. I'm doing my best to deserve that salvation. That's all I can do. Victor Steiner. Owen died in 1982. Heart attack while working in his garden on a beautiful spring afternoon. Quick and clean, which was a mercy even as it was devastating. They'd had 37 years after the war. More than many couples got less than she'd wanted. Never enough time with the man who'd understood her in ways no one else ever could. The reunion invitation arrived in May of 1984, 40 years since VE Day. The Herne Heritage League was organizing a commemoration. All former prisoners invited. All staff invited. A weekend of remembrance and reconciliation. Rosalind was 69 years old, retired from teaching, widowed. Her children grown with children of their own who'd never known war, who couldn't imagine what their grandmother had done. She almost declined the invitation. Almost decided the past should stay buried, that resurrection served no purpose. Then she thought about Owen's letter, those words she'd finally opened on Christmas Eve 1943, love is stronger than war, please prove it true. She'd spent 40 years trying to prove it. She decided she wanted to see if she'd succeeded. Camp Herne had been converted into a museum in 1975 for the 30th anniversary. The barracks were gone, replaced by a memorial garden with plaques listing every prisoner who'd passed through. But the library still stood preserved exactly as it had been during the war. 5,000 books on the same shelves in the same order. She stood in the center of the room and was 28 again for a moment, standing here with trembling hands and 180 names, unsure if transformation was even possible, terrified she wasn't strong enough for what they were asking. Mrs. Ashford. Heinrich stood in the doorway, 69 now, like her, silver-haired and dignified, wearing a suit that marked him as successful and prosperous. Behind him, more men filed in. 50 former prisoners had made the journey across the Atlantic, some from Germany, some from America where they'd immigrated legally and built new lives far from the ruins. Franz approached, older but still recognizable, still carrying himself with that earnest intensity. My daughter couldn't come. She's defending her dissertation at Yale next week. Literature, of course, but she wanted me to give you this. He handed her a letter, his hands steady now, despite everything. She says you're the reason she exists, that if you hadn't taught me to think, I wouldn't have become the father who encouraged her to think. That your library rippled forward through generations in ways you never saw or knew about. More men approached, each with a story. Teachers and politicians and businessmen and fathers who'd raised children in democracy instead of dictatorship. Who'd built a different Germany from the one they'd left. Who'd kept the peace for 40 years when previous generations had managed only 20 before violence erupted again. They gathered in the library and someone had arranged chairs in the same semicircle from 40 years ago. Heinrich spoke first. We came here as Nazis, young men who believed in racial superiority and German destiny and the 1,000-year Reich. We left as something else. Democrats, some of us, anti-fascists, human beings who'd learned to question instead of just obeying. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments across months. A book that challenged what we'd been taught, a question we couldn't answer with propaganda, an act of impossible kindness from people who had every reason to hate us. Franz added, voice thick with emotion. 48 of us became politicians in the new Germany. 312 became teachers or civil servants. Thousands more raised children who grew up in democracy, who never knew fascism, who learned from birth that all humans have equal value. The German economic miracle wasn't just about Marshall Plan money or hard work. It was about people like us who came home from American camps with fundamentally different ideas about how society should work. The testimonies continued for an hour, each man adding his piece to a collective story of transformation that seemed almost too good to be true but wasn't. The evidence stood before her in aging faces and grateful voices. Finally, someone asked Rosalind to speak. She stood slowly, feeling every one of her 69 years, feeling the weight of Owen's absence and the presence of these men who'd become something she'd never quite dared hope for. I came here in December of 1943, she began. My husband was missing in the Pacific. My country was at war. I'd been given 180 names and 5,000 books and told to transform enemies into allies, fascists into Democrats. I didn't think it was possible. I thought books were just books. That ideology ran too deep. That hatred was stronger than hope or education or kindness. She looked at the faces around her, older now, marked by decades, but still recognizable. You proved me wrong. Not immediately, not easily, not without cost or pain or violence. But consistently, one by one, you chose to read books that might get you beaten. You chose to question beliefs that kept you safe. You chose to accept kindness from enemies when hatred would have been easier and more understandable. You chose transformation over the comfort of certainty. And then you went home to a country in ruins and you built something different, something better, something that's kept the peace for 40 years. Her voice thickened. My husband died 2 years ago, but before he died, he told me that what we did here, what you did, what you became, mattered more than anything else we'd accomplished in our lives. That if German and American children weren't fighting another war, we'd succeeded. That peace was the only victory that counted in the end. She gestured at the men around her. You are that peace, you and your children and your grandchildren. You are proof that enemies can become allies, that education is more powerful than hatred, that love really is stronger than war when we choose to make it so. Silence filled the library like water filling a vessel. Then Heinrich stood and began to applaud. Others joined until all 50 former prisoners were on their feet, applauding the woman who'd given them forbidden books and dangerous questions and the chance to become something other than what 12 years of Nazi education had tried to make them. Among the letters read that day was one from Sergeant Elijah Carver, now a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. You taught German prisoners the dignity America denied me in 1943. That lesson, as painful as it was to witness, showed me that my real fight was just beginning, that true democracy had to be won at home, not just exported to defeated enemies. Thank you for that unintended lesson. After the ceremony, Rosalind stood alone in the library one final time, ran her hand along the spines of books that had been weapons in a war most people didn't know had been fought, a war for minds and souls and the future of an entire nation. She thought about the questions she'd asked herself 40 years ago, standing in this exact spot. About whether kindness to Germans was betrayal, about whether education could transform men who'd believed in genocide, about whether she was strong enough for any of it. The answers were written in the faces of the men who'd come here today, in their children pursuing doctorates at Yale, in their grandchildren growing up in stable democracy, in 40 years without another world war, in the Federal Republic of Germany as America's close ally instead of bitter enemy. She'd been strong enough. The books had been strong enough. Love had been stronger than war. Outside, the Texas sun was setting exactly as it had set on this place every evening since she'd first arrived in December of 1943. She walked out of the library for the last time, closed the door behind her. Let it become history while the lessons remained written in the world. Written in constitutions and peace treaties and children who didn't have to fight their parents' wars. That night in her hotel room, Rosalind wrote in her journal one final time. December 15th, 1943. I stood in a library and wondered if books could change minds. May 20th, 1984. I stood in the same library and knew they could. Not because of the books themselves, but because of people who chose to read them despite threats and fear. Who chose to question despite the safety of certainty. The most powerful weapon against fascism wasn't the atomic bomb or Allied armies or American industrial might. It was a woman teaching German prisoners to read banned books. A town giving gifts to enemies. Mothers singing for soldiers who might have killed their sons. The radical insistence that human beings are worth saving, worth teaching, worth treating with dignity even when they've been monsters. Owen was right. Love is stronger than war, not as sentiment, as choice. The choice to see humanity in enemies. The choice to educate instead of punish. The choice to plant seeds of peace even when victory alone seems sufficient. I planted those seeds 40 years ago. They grew, they're growing still. That's all any of us can do, plant seeds and hope they grow and trust that future generations will water them. It's enough. It has to be enough. She closed the journal, turned off the light. And Rosalind Ashford, 69 years old, widow, teacher, woman who'd weaponized education against fascism, slept deeply for the first time since Owen died, because she'd finally definitively proved what he'd asked her to prove, that love, when chosen deliberately and courageously, really is stronger than war.